right, folks, as you know, we have transitioned from our discussion of the executive branch to the judicial branch. Hopefully, you've uh, been through the judicial branch overview presentation that we've got for you. I want to pause just for a second and look at a history of the Supreme Court. Put a picture here for you of the room in the U.S. Capitol where the Supreme Court met for much of its early history. It has, of course, its own building today, the Supreme Court building, but it was in the basement of the Capitol for a good portion of its time. We just want to highlight some famous names, some famous decisions that happened during the early days of the court. If you're watching this online, I've got some great videos on the YouTube playlist as well that will fill in some of these gaps and give you some deeper insight into the topics that I'm going to throw out to you. Article 3, right, we have talked about already, says that judicial power rests with a Supreme Court. It also gives Congress the power to create other federal courts. And we saw in that lesson that we've really got kind of a three-tiered system of federal courts in our country. And the job of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws. And so we've got a legislature that makes the laws, an executive that enforces the laws, and finally, the kind of the third part of this three-part government, we've got a judicial branch that will interpret the laws. The first Supreme Court actually had 6 justices on it. One chief justice, his name was John Jay. This is a picture of John Jay, and then 5 associate justices that would serve. Now, I found that kind of interesting because today we have 9, and I think that you would probably have wanted an odd number just for so you didn't have tie votes. But like I said, in the beginning they had 6. Like most of the United States government before Washington, D.C. was built, its home was in New York City. The first case the Supreme Court is going to hear is one called West versus Barnes, or West v. Barnes. It actually is settled before the Supreme Court can make a decision, but not a particularly important case, but one of the first ones that comes across. But like I said before, a ruling can be handed down by the Supreme Court. It is settled out of court. John Jay was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, and so arguing for the Constitution. So he was kind of a natural to put in as a Supreme Court Chief Justice. He doesn't keep the job very long, though. Today we think of the Supreme Court as being kind of a lifetime appointment. John Jay will actually resign from the Supreme Court and become governor of the state of New York. It's not until our 4th Supreme Court Justice, a fellow we'll see here in a second, that really becomes an important part of our government and an important role that people wouldn't want to give up. So the 4th Chief Justice is a man named John Marshall. John Marshall will serve in that role for 34 years, so a really long time he will be there, and he's considered by a lot of people to be one of the most important Chief Justices we have, just because of how he's going to position the court as an equal branch of our government. In the history of the Supreme Court, we have had 17 Chief Justices and 104 Associate Justices. Now, that number goes up a little bit if you look at Associate Justices who were eventually promoted to being Chief Justice. But there haven't been very many justices on the Supreme Court. If you go back through, the average time of service as a Supreme Court Justice is about 16 years. The longest time, as I was seeing, 35, 36 years is sometimes the longest that you see. And so this is somebody, when the president appoints them, that can have a much longer lasting effect. As I'm recording this in 2020, Amy Coney Barrett has just been appointed by President Trump. He's appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court during his time on the court. And so that legacy for him is going to last, long after he's gone. There will still be justices that he's appointed to the Supreme Court that are making decisions. In 1869, we go to our current size, which is 9 justices. So you have 1 chief and 8 associate justices of the Supreme Court today. There's been a little bit of talk lately about increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Really, the time that got probably most serious was in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt, but nothing ever came of it. So 9 justices is where we sit today. The probably the most important court case that you don't know about in the history of the Supreme Court happens in 1803. It's a court case called Marbury versus Madison, and it has to do with an appointment that was made by John Adams. But I've got a little video that'll explain the nuts and bolts of the case to you. Basically, the thing that you need to know about Marbury versus Madison is that it's the case that establishes judicial review, which John Marshall writes an opinion saying that the Supreme Court has the power to rule a law of Congress unconstitutional. And if that law violates the Constitution, then they can kick that law out. So that's where we see a lot of the power of the Supreme Court coming from, is this ability of judicial review. Key events in the history of the Supreme Court. 1921, William Howard Taft, who had been President of the United States from 1908 to 1912, will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which was a big deal for him. It had been a lifelong ambition of his, and so he's appointed by Warren G. Harding. He's the only president to serve as Chief Justice. 1967, we have our first African-American Supreme Court Justice, a man named Thurgood Marshall. He had been a lead lawyer for the NAACP, had helped argue important cases like Brown versus the Board of Education before the court, and then he will become a member of the court in the late 60s. Sandra Day O'Connor is the first female Supreme Court Justice. She was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Apparently, Richard Nixon had thought very hard about appointing a woman to the court. His wife got mad at him because he basically promised her he was going to and then didn't. One of Reagan's campaign promises, though, was that he would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. And the first Hispanic justice is Sonia Sotomayor. And so she was appointed by President Obama in 2009. The last video I'm going to put on the playlist here, I'll include this funny video. The last, as I'm recording this, the last justice to pass away was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is depicted in the movie On the Basis of Sex, which is a very good movie that is on your timeline there for you to watch. She becomes, later on in life, kind of a pop culture figure. They call her the notorious RBG. And she was played by Kate McKinnon on Saturday Night Live. And so I included one of those skits there for her. But really, she kind of transcends the role of Supreme Court Justice. Usually we don't know or you don't see a whole lot about the Supreme Court Justices. They stay pretty low key. But she becomes kind of a pop culture icon in her own right. So I want you to head over to the playlist and take a look at some of those videos that I'll be showing to the in-person students while we're there, but to give you a little bit more background on all things history of the Supreme Court.